Welcome to season 3 of Talk ADHD, Conversations Worth Having. This podcast is here to help you make sense of ADHD, using a combination of interviews with the leading voices in the field of ADHD, as well as commentary from Andrew and I on the topics that are being discussed around ADHD. We hope this podcast and its evidence-based approach is what you need to really make sense of ADHD for you. Andrew is an ADHD clinician and a neurodevelopmental expert, and I am a neurodivergent author, educator, mentor, and consultant. It's our passion to make sure that everything we do and everyone we speak to talks from an evidence-based approach. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of Talk ADHD. A space to say, this isn't about whether you think you did ADHD right. It's about what did it mean to you and what does it mean now? What do you need now and going forward?
Matt Gupwell is a globally recognized ADHD mentor
whose work has helped millions of people understand their neurodivergent brains.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is Talk ADHD, and we're back after a short break with episode 3 of season 3. And this is a slightly different approach for you and I, because what's prompted us recording this is that I was on another ADHD podcast this week, and it's about looking at what that means and how that came across, and maybe using that as a way to help people make sense of all of the information they may see on social media about ADHD. So We'll dive straight in if that's all right with you. For those of you that aren't aware of the podcast, and you'll have seen it in the trailer for this episode or heard it, ADHD Chatter is now, I believe, the biggest podcast on ADHD in Europe. It's hosted by Alex Partridge, who was famous for being the founder of Unilad and Lad Bible in his 20s. So his podcast, in terms of views and listens, eclipses most by miles. I have since been a guest on that podcast 5 times. This was the 5th appearance. For me, what's interesting about that is the podcast has now been going for that 2 years. I think he's up to 300 different plus episodes. And it's been a mixture across the episodes of professionals working in the industry to celebrities and everyone in between, including me. Now, from an imposter syndrome point of view, every time he's asked me, would I go back on? My response has always, first of all, been, why? Why are you asking me again? Alex's point of view, and I'm very grateful for it because I count him as a friend now, is because he values my opinions and values me as someone who's, in his words, a very powerful voice in this conversation about ADHD. I'm very grateful for that, although slightly baffled by it. This episode, which I recorded now a couple of weeks ago, was the first time I've very much told Alex and his production team what I wanted to talk about. And I wanted to talk about some of the things that are important to me. So late diagnosis and very late diagnosis and why it's different, and concepts like loneliness and grief and some of the coping strategies we fall into. What people might not realize when they watch these episodes is, unlike ours, which is what I class as a free form conversation, we briefly discuss what we'll talk about and then press record. On podcasts like Alex's and others, we have a pre-recorded conversation first, and out of the points that are raised, the questions are written. So I knew the questions in advance. I knew about 7 days before what I was going to be asked and what I was going to say. So on this occasion, I drove from Birmingham, where I live, to centre of London, where his studio is, which is, well, it was on that day a 2 hours and 20-minute drive because London. And I rehearsed. I mean, I genuinely rehearsed my answers so that I felt comfortable when I got there. The reality being, I got there late. I was already flustered. I was embarrassed for keeping them all waiting. So most of that rehearsal kind of went out the window, and I forgot some of the salient points. And when we finished recording, I told Alex that we're going to get called on certain things here. There are things I forgot and things I know I got wrong, or things that I didn't like, which we'll talk about. However, if you have watched it, or if you do go and watch it, the one thing you will hear me say over and over again is, I'm not an expert. I'm not a professional. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a specialist. I'm just someone who's invested in this and passionate about it, because I wanted to be very clear I'm very honest about who I am and who I'm not. I don't want to be judged for claiming something I'm not. Now, why are we talking about this then, Andrew? Well, because you watched it and you said some really interesting things. You commented on the YouTube channel. I mean, nice, but you commented on it. And then we've spoke since. And I think it really raised the question of, okay, you've looked at it uniquely, I suppose, in two ways through two different filters. One is Andrew, the late diagnosed adult with ADHD. And one is Andrew, the ADHD specialist neurodevelopmental clinician who knows the science and the evidence, right? And who I have learned from. So what you have said is really important for people to hear. So let's start first and foremost with this. As a person with ADHD, putting clinician aside, when you see content like that, what is it you're looking for, or why is it you maybe watch?
So I'd stopped watching ADHD Chatter. I pick up the odd episode here and there because it's much of a muchness. And I watched that one because it was you and I wanted to see what you were saying. Because how dare you go on another podcast? You know, they were conversations that we could have had, but we couldn't have had that conversation. And the ADHD Chatter format created a space for you to give what was a very humble and genuine insight into how you see the landscape of ADHD at the moment, a response to the task force interim report, what you're hearing from people who are navigating services, the work that we're doing with Divergence. All of that came together into a really coherent episode that was so genuine and so from the heart. And yes, there were mistakes, and we can talk through some of those, but they didn't matter because what shines through, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't seen it to switch this off and go and watch that and come back to this conversation, because this conversation will make much more sense if you do. But yeah, what an episode. I think you and Alex should be very proud of what you achieved. As someone with ADHD, I felt you were speaking for us, and I don't often feel that. When I watch content, I often feel that I'm watching someone trotting out a script, a line, and that often sort of rings alarm bells for me. But there was none of that with that episode, and it stands out as a very different kind of episode of ADHD Chatter.
I'm still really grateful when you say that, although, because I'll use this word a lot, baffled. But let's dig into that a little bit. Alex has now had over 300 guests. It's a mixture of very, very well-known celebrities, very, very, well, to some people, very well-known professionals in various roles within the industry. Clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, Ned Halliwell being about the most well-known in terms of this conversation, and then me. And, if you were to look at it based in solely in terms of, I don't know, whatever social media ranking is, or the fame ranking, compared to almost everyone else he's had on, I'm no one. I don't rank anywhere in that metric. However, in other spaces, people are aware of me and know what I do, and, professionally and on LinkedIn. So there's a different reputation, but I can only go on and talk from what I know, what I believe, because I've researched, seen the evidence, spoke to professionals I respect about. And I can only go on and talk about the experience I've had of working with other people, of mentoring people, of, running courses, of trying to support people, and what I hear from them as well. And I think that was something I was really, really conscious of this time, was I really wanted to hammer home the point about that I look to both sides of information with equal importance. I place equal importance on people's experience, good, bad, indifferent, of what these things mean, as well as the research and the evidence, right? We've used this phrase before. I'm trying to bridge the gap. I'm trying to close the gap. I'm trying to stop people seeing it as a them versus us conversation in that vein. But what I can't do is claim some sort of expertise that I don't have, because that would be disingenuous.
Yeah.
So knowing what the questions were in advance, knowing what I wanted to say, trying to rehearse them as I did, most of them came off well. I think I answered in the way I wanted to. The comments on the YouTube are actually a mixture of people who clearly felt it spoke to them in the same way you did, people who were appreciative of some of the frameworks I was trying to use about skill regression actually being processing, for example. What I want to get across is that the intent behind it wasn't to prove anything. It wasn't me, blowing my own trumpet. It was, I'm very grateful to be asked. So if I'm going to be given a platform on another podcast, I'm going to take it, right? I'm going to do my very best to use that to share some of the information I think is important. But, and I very clearly said this during the recording, I was speaking for most of that from my opinion, based on the things I've heard and the things I've learned and the conversations I've had. And yes, my interpretation of them. And I freely admit that. That's why it was important for me to be very clear that my opinions don't mean I'm saying I'm right. They are me saying my opinion is based on this. You know, one of the biggest topics we spoke about was I've been rattling around this idea of how many men that were deemed to have had a midlife crisis in the 80s, 70s, you know, the tropes. How many of them may have been undiagnosed? How many of them may have actually been hitting a phase in life where all of a sudden they couldn't make sense of their own brains and that running in the opposite direction of what they had, while seeming like the midlife crisis may have been a cry for help and a diagnosis could have helped. Now, there is no evidence, there's no research that's published on that. But, you know, I spoke to you, I actually reached out to Steve Ferrone and asked a similar question, right, about this and about testosterone and about, you know, what about dropping testosterone levels in middle age? And you both said the same thing, that possibility that it's correlation, but we've got no evidence to say it's causality. Now, that's just cold hard facts. But the reason I wanted to talk about it and just put it in people's minds is there's somebody there now struggling in their early to mid 40s or 50s, feeling like their world's fallen apart. And if they maybe hear that and think, I've never considered that, or if somebody else hears it and says, look, you might want to listen to this and it helps them, how can that be a bad thing?
But it's a theme that we see. It's a theme that we see. Alex talked about the demographic that watches ADHD Chatter being 85% women between 40 and 60. Well, hey, guess what? We can match that data on the Divergence website access. It's exactly the same proportion. And I share that concern that there are a lot of middle-aged men who are just saying, I'm a bit crap. That can't be that. It's not that. It's just me not managing. This is how research questions get asked by people like us having these conversations that then someone picks up on and does the research. I'm hearing lots of self-criticism there when you're talking about yourself and this sort of sense of imposter syndrome, which I think is invalid. But that's the nature of this thing that we call imposter syndrome, isn't it? That it makes you question the validity. You know, the last episode we put out, we've got Steve Ferrone, president of the World Federation, talking about his inability to communicate the science as well as he would like to. Yet, you know, his name's in the back of all those reports.
Yeah.
It's there all the time. He does communicate. He just doesn't communicate like this. We all have our strengths. I know Alex was, as is Alex's style, to be quite hyperbolic about credentials of his guests. And I'm sure you felt uncomfortable with some of the stuff that he's put on about who you are. But, you know, when you say I emailed Steve Ferrone to ask what his opinion was, that there's a reason Steve Ferrone emailed back, because you have earned that respect. And you earn that respect by putting out genuine content, by being vulnerable, by being someone who will say things that might not fit with the trends or might question the trends. But that is how the truth comes out, isn't it? By people questioning the trends. If we always just say, oh, ADHD is leaving your washing in the washing machine, then that's all it ever is. And having questions about why is it only 15% of men is the proportion that's watching ADHD Chatter, because it's the demographic as far as guests are concerned. It's not 85% women on there talking about perimenopause. There are men going on talking about men's issues, going on to Chatter, not just you raising it, but other men as well. So I think it's almost paradoxical, isn't it? This sense that I don't deserve to be there, but if that's the very reason that you do, and that humility that comes across that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, that creates a genuineness that can be seen that sometimes isn't there. And certainly I've seen a lack of genuineness in other guests on ADHD Chatter, where it might come across as more polished, and they may not be flustered and have been late and be dealing with all of that. But actually that is the very thing that makes that your episode with Alex so much more real. It isn't I mean, it is a polished episode, but it isn't that scripted. I can say this that I've said on 1,000 other podcasts. It's real.
Yeah, that element about it being scripted and rehearsed, as much as I try to rehearse it in the car to calm my own nerves and anxiety, a lot of that stuff is stuff that's rattled around my head, and I've had kind of private conversations maybe with you about or at home about, but I've never said a lot of that, broadly speaking, in public, and certainly not knowing it was going to reach an audience the size of Alex's. And so there is an element of fear when I say things that I know challenge the narrative. When I say things that I know will really frustrate people because it's not what they've heard, I can say, wait a minute, I know why you're saying you feel it's that. I understand where you've seen people tell you it's that, but that isn't the experience I am seeing. I guess what I was trying to do on that was encourage people to not be told what their experience of having ADHD or autism is, but to figure out how they find out what their own experience of having ADHD and autism is. I use this phrase, go away and understand what it means to you, not what it means to someone else, not what you're told it should mean, because that's not you. They're not in your world. But again, I understand it's difficult. So let's sort of flip this then. I spoke about a lot of these things. I spoke about these topics and these subjects and answered the questions. Now, as I said, I knew when the recording stopped, I made some mistakes by my own definition, and I know I did. So the first one was I was talking about grief and are there similarities between processing an ADHD diagnosis, late or not, and grief. And I referenced the Kubler-Ross model. And in that flustered state, and I think it even made the recording, I said, I know I'm going to get this wrong, because I knew I had. And I missed a complete stage of the Kubler-Ross model, which was anger. I completely forgot it, which is crackers now I sit here and think about it. However, what I still tried to do was explain what I'd seen in the other stages and how they related to the experiences I have had and other people have told me they've had of processing their diagnosis. Now, I know there are people that would view that as, oh, well, there you are saying you're the expert and you can't even get that right. That was one of the comments. And not so many was, oh, you got the Kubler-Ross model wrong, so clearly you don't know what you're on about. No, I was very honest. I knew I got it wrong. And it's not the kind of thing where I could just say, oh, can we go again? Because there isn't time. That's interesting to me. I would prefer to have kept going and tried to explain it the best I could and that be genuine than for it to have felt so polished, like you said, like I've said it a million times before. And actually, it comes off as a bit disingenuous. Now, you listen to it, clinician Andrew, ADHD Andrew. What does clinician Andrew make of, whether it's me or someone else, when you hear things and people trying to explain concepts using known models or frameworks and they get those things wrong?
So with reference to that mistake, you say there are 5 stages to grief. You're very clear on that. And then you list 4. And clinician Andrew heard that and went, oh, Matt, you've missed one. But clinician Andrew very quickly moved on from that because I wanted to hear what you were saying about the model. It doesn't undermine your understanding of the model that you forgot to talk about anger as one of the 5. And how bloody relevant is that to the point you were making about the movement around a model that anyone can go and read and find that, yes, you didn't mention anger in that moment, in that conversation. Talking as you did about that model and how people move around in that model, that's entirely valid. And you do get experts saying things wrong. That happens. It happens sometimes because you're so familiar with it, sometimes because you have a shortcut thought and it's just in the moment, it's not important to say the 5 things. It's more important to say there are these 5 things and I want to talk about how 4 of them relate to each other. I'd like to have talked about 5, but there's 4. So, and if someone's focused on just that you haven't listed the 5 right, they're missing the point. Absolutely missing the point. Because people make mistakes and they are human. There's actually research about this. People are more believable when they do make mistakes, which if you follow the chain of logic, that's because they're being genuine. If you sat there and trotted out those 5, what would you have not said? If you'd been more focused on being able to list those 5 things textbook-wise that any of us can look up, you just Google it and there it is, the 5 stages of grief. And sad that someone feels they need to score a point by saying, you missed one. You knew you missed one. You knew as you were listing them that you were going to miss one. And there are all sorts of reasons in psychological literature as to why that happens, but it does not undermine in any way the expertise with which you delivered a heartfelt explanation of the relationship between that model and reaction to diagnosis. So if someone's going to listen to, you didn't list that right, then they're not ever going to hear the point that you're trying to make. So I don't think there's any great loss there. Yes, it did jar, but it was very quickly passed. There are two more mistakes that I'd like to talk about.
Hi, it's Matt. Sorry to butt in the middle of the episode. I just wanted to have a chat to you about the sponsors for Talk ADHD, which we don't have. In fact, we're never going to be sponsored. So that means that this is a passion project for Andrew and I, and we really rely on your support. So if you can take time to like, comment, and subscribe, it really helps this podcast grow organically. And that means it reaches more people, and more people get to hear the information that you know is helping you. So once again, thank you for listening or watching wherever you do, but please do like, comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so never miss any information about our latest episode.
So the other main one, the other sort of evidence one, the point you made was coherent and it made sense. However, you made reference to a conversation you'd had with Steve Ferrone, and I was in the room when you had that conversation, and you misquoted Steve. So you were talking about different numbers of symptoms of ADHD and impairment and how that reflects in diagnosis. So for a diagnosis of ADHD, depending on your age, you need 5 or 6 symptoms of inattention, or 5 or 6 of symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity, or more than 5 or 6 of both to get the combined type. The combined presentation diagnosis. And the way you presented it was someone who has 8 symptoms meets the criteria, someone who has 4 does not. And what Steve had said, because when you sort of carried on explaining, you said that the person who has 4 symptoms may have all sorts of problems, may be facing as many difficulties in day-to-day functioning as the person with 8 symptoms. And that wasn't the conversation that we'd had with Steve. It's valid, and it's there in the ADHD Task Force Interim Report, this idea of subthreshold ADHD. If it's subthreshold, then it's not ADHD. It's symptoms of inattention, symptoms of hyperactivity or impulsivity. In my opinion, it's not a helpful concept to call it subthreshold ADHD, because you have to be over the threshold to call it ADHD. But that doesn't invalidate someone with 4 symptoms on that list of 18 symptoms struggling with their attention or their hyperactivity, impulsivity. Yeah. The bigger point that Steve was making in our conversation was someone can have 6 symptoms of inattention and meet the criteria for a diagnosis, but another person can have 4 symptoms of inattention and 4 symptoms of hyperactivity or impulsivity, therefore 8 symptoms of ADHD, but not meet the threshold, the symptom threshold for the diagnosis of ADHD. So they've got more symptoms, yet don't meet the criteria for the diagnosis. That's a different group than this person who's just got 4 symptoms. But you weren't wrong in what you said. It was just a different point. So you were talking about this not meeting the criteria wholesale, rather than these criteria draw this line between inattention and hyperactivity, and is that a helpful thing to do? And so it was a subtle point, but when I listened to it, I thought, oh, you've missed the point, and I had to rethink it. I had that, oh, you didn't put that 5th. I did it. Guilty. Hold my hands up. I did that. Oh, you forgot the 5th symptom of grief. But when I reflected on it, I thought, actually, you made a fair point about stuff that's in the interim report, but you hadn't represented what Steve had said, which was about, yes, it's possible to have more than 6 symptoms, but because they're spread across the 2 different symptom clusters, it's not a diagnosis. And that's an issue about diagnostics, not thresholds, and how we separate out these things. Because, talk to the big names. You talk to Steve Ferrone, talk to Russell Barkley, talk to Nez Hallowell. They talk about this idea of where are we drawing these lines, and how valuable are these lines, because we make false lines. It doesn't matter whether you're listing 4 or 5 stages of grief. You're just talking about this thing called grief and navigating that. And I think what you do well, and this moves on to my third thing that you get wrong, and you've made the same mistake today, but this is this concept of you not being an expert. Now, I jar when you call me an expert, but you have to take this as well. Your expertise comes from your experience. Your expertise comes from a willingness to question what you're being told and reevaluate your whole perspective. And I've seen this a number of times. We've had conversations, you've gone away and gone, actually, yeah, you're right, and looked into stuff. And that takes expertise. And that episode of ADHD Chatter, you come across with a better working knowledge of the landscape of ADHD in the UK than many people who you would list in this hierarchy that you seem to have in your head above you. The reach of your understanding of how all of this dances together is an expertise. And all right, it might not be a clinical expertise. You might not be someone doing a PhD in psychology or a social scientist. You're a human being, but one with experience that has driven you to expertise because of your love of your children. And that's powerful.
It is, and you're right. He says, taking a deep breath. Yes, you're right. Yeah, all right, it's wrapped up in imposter syndrome. Never once have I claimed to be a clinical or like an academic or a research expert. Never once, because ultimately someone's going to find out and no, you're not, right? And then what do I look like? I look like a fool. I will lean into experience, and I accept experience, and I accept passion. And I think that's when, in the first question Alex asked me about what's your speciality, I said I don't like that question because I'm not a specialist. I'm a passionate person, but I'm not a specialist. That to me, that's different. I think I suppose the reason I am so adamant about saying that publicly, when the opportunity arises to answer that, I feel for me it's almost safer to rebut that and say, no, I'm not. Don't call me that. If somebody else wants to call me that, if you want to call me that, Steve or someone else, that's fine. I'm very flattered. I won't say it about me because in my head, that says I can then not be accused of claiming something I am not. I think that's just the nature of the world that we live in. I'm trying to do a bit of self-preservation. But I think that opens up a really interesting conversation, right? I'm one of many people without any qualifications per se, talking frequently, often, and passionately about these things called ADHD and autism and neurodiversity and everything else. Now, you said something on Tuesday when the episode came out, and I kind of sat there and went, right? Because you actually said, given that, you could almost call yourself an influencer.
I did that on purpose.
I know, yeah, that made me feel physically unwell. No disrespect to anyone that has influencer as a career, honestly. Good for you, but no, that's not what I've ever wanted to be seen as. And here's the reason, right? Joking aside, because I think what we've got is this opinion of the word influencer being influence often without expertise or experience, right? Versus someone trying to speak from evidence and experience. So I find that very uncomfortable. But there's a part of me that goes, it's an interesting conversation. Why am I so uncomfortable with that? Why shouldn't I celebrate that? I asked Alex on the way home from recording a question, which I found fascinating. I said, do you think if you weren't Alex Partridge, Lad Bible Uni Lad, if you weren't that, would you still be doing this after a diagnosis? And he very honestly said, likely not, because who would I be? I'd just be another voice in a lot of voices. And he's very grateful. He's very humble about the fact that he is Alex Partridge of Uni Lad. It's every time he does a job, every time he speaks, that's on the promotion, right? Because that's the hook. So I asked him, given that you keep coming to me, telling me you think I'm an expert, asking me to be on your podcast, how does that work for me then? What's my hook? Because I didn't start one of the world's biggest social media brands when I was 21. That's not me. So the introduction to the episode was him showing me how he would promote me. And again, you're right. I heard that and went, I'm going to get pushback. That's going to annoy people. And it's not what I said. I didn't write that bit, but, I understand it. But this is interesting to me. Why am I so uncomfortable with that, yet so passionate that everything I say comes from an evidence base? And yet there are people whose content is not blatantly not evidence-based, who seem to care not a jot. And how do people then see those two different styles of content make the distinction between, is it followers, numbers, likes and reach that equals credibility, or is it the actual content within the content that equals credibility? Does that make sense?
It does, and this has been a theme in our conversations from starting this podcast, that almost we need both, and the spectrum between both. That everybody has their place. You know, our last episode, Steve Ferrone refers to himself as a nerd. We need the nerds to do the stuff that other people would find boring, but it gives that robust, unquestionable, based on doing this the way things have to be done in science, this fact. Best understanding. Whereas someone making a reel about leaving their in the washing machine, that's a common experience, and that is a valid piece of communication as well. But they're not the same. And I think podcasts like this one hopefully sit in between that and say both are valid, but for different reasons. A thought that's run through my mind while we've been talking is there something about your hesitance to say that your expertise is valid that hinders the communication of that expertise? Yeah, as much as it irks you that some sort of glamorous influencers will say things that just are blatantly not true but get millions and millions of likes, perhaps it should be irking us that we don't say this is true, this is the evidence base, and that there is room to be an expert in your sphere of competence, to use a term that nurses like to use. I don't claim to be a world-leading psychologist, researcher, neither do you. Neither do we claim to be founder of Lab Bible. We don't want to be those people. There's someone else is doing that with great expertise already. But there is a place for what we do. And is that something that we ADHDers do? And I see this in clinic, this sort of self-questioning, self-critical approach, which perhaps we learn through compensation, through masking, through adolescence, becoming aware of difference and sort of wanting to hide that difference when actually that difference is our individuality, our uniqueness. And if it's valid for someone to trumpet their glossy but not very factually based stuff, or someone to be a professor of psychology, then it's equally valid for us to say, well, ours counts too. But reflecting where that sits on this spectrum of awareness. That's the bit that's missing, isn't it? Is that people don't say, and this is where that piece of information belongs. It's not as rigorously researched as something that Steve would say, and it's not as socially likable on social media as something that name no names will say. It's what I'm saying. It's my experience, and it's genuine and it's valid, and it's perhaps what I'm liking about the episode that you did with Alex is how you did that without being aware that you did it.
I was trying to be aware of it, but it's interesting. I had a conversation about this recently, and a friend shares a lot of reels on a group chat. Never any of ours, but lots of the other kinds of content. And a lot of it is the stuff that, yes, okay, it's the other end of that spectrum where it's got absolutely no evidence to it. I find it mostly very stereotypical, borderline offensive, and quite demeaning. But it's billed as comedy / awareness. And I know that a lot of that information is what people see early doors, and it makes them go, oh, I've never thought of that being ADHD. And it might set them down the path of watching that for a while and then thinking, do I need an assessment? And again, there's a place for that. But when I challenge that and say, work my ass off trying to make this podcast with you and trying to put reels out that get eyes, and was told, yeah, but I only watch things if they're funny. Right. Okay. So there's no room then in that model for credible, useful, helpful information, evidence-based, if it's not funny. That's not the only time I've heard that. That's why that other content does so well. But there's something about that I think is very hard for me personally to reconcile, because, forgive me, I don't find people struggling all their adult lives or all their lives and getting a late life diagnosis of something that upends their life for a while and is really hard to process. I don't find that funny. I struggle with the concept. Now, maybe that's autism. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a belligerent 50-something, but I don't see the humor in that. So when I see people making content that is, to me, just flippant, I find that unhelpful, because it makes me think that's just perpetuating the stereotypes that actually we're just not trying hard enough and we're just a bit silly. And if we just did this and if we just did that, right? And that does not help in my eyes. Now, others will say different. And you're right. I think there is a space for us and there's a space for everyone else. I suppose in terms of reach and volume, it's a very difficult conversation, isn't it? It's a very difficult thing. So I go on Alex's podcast then, not because it's funny and I didn't try to be a comedian, but I go on because I know it gets eyes, it gets ears. And I hope that people seeing that will come here and then they'll hear this conversation and others and go, well, wait a minute, that's very different. And I'll go back through our back catalogue. I think what this all leads into, Andrew, is some of the broader topics we are seeing discussed about ADHD and autism online and the way that the information being shared about those is being received or taken or believed, right? So to tee this up for next week, I think some of the conversations worth us having are the ones that are happening all the time. Now, we've touched on this with Steve. ADHD is huge. The conversation about the understanding of women and ADHD and the fact that there's never been any research done into women. Right? Okay. I mean, just those alone are dominating an awful lot of headlines. Within them, there are others. But I think they very much are wrapped up in this conversation we have had about what we try to achieve with this content, about why I'm so uncomfortable with using the label an expert, and yet why there are others very confidently and loudly saying things seemingly without any of that concern or worry. So I think that will be a really important thing for us to talk about in the next episode, because we build this podcast as Talk ADHD Conversations Worth Having. And those are the conversations that are happening that you who are listening and watching to this will be seeing. And if we can help you make sense of how to filter what is evidence-based and what is opinion and what's the difference, and not whether one's better or worse, but how to use both, then for me, that's what we started this podcast for. How do you feel about that as the next conversation we have then, Andrew?
They're separate conversations. I think we have to think about what presenting information and what using media is through those conversations. I think we're probably going to need to draw on some information that we don't agree with and actually say, okay, here's the spread of information. Here's where we see it fitting. And we might be wrong, and it might be open up a conversation with our audience about how wrong we are, but that will help us. That conversation is worth having. Hopefully that will make more of a dialogue, because we're all just trying to make sense of this thing called ADHD with our own expertise in ourselves.
Sounds like a plan. Okay, Andrew, in which case, listen, thank you very much for all of the kind words you've said about the episode of ADHD Chatter. And to everyone else, please go away and watch it. And
Please do, yeah.
let us know your thoughts. Come back to this episode, put a comment in, tell us what you thought of it. Tell us what you were challenged by or felt spoke to you. Because again, your comments help us shape the conversations of this podcast. And that's really important to Andrew and I going forwards. But for now, thank you all for watching and listening and reading along, however and wherever you do. We genuinely appreciate it. And we will see you for another episode of Talk ADHD very soon indeed. Thanks again for watching and listening to this week's episode of Talk ADHD. We really do hope it helped. And as you now know, it really helps us if you can like, comment, and subscribe to this episode, this channel, and this podcast. Your help helps this channel continue to grow and helps our information reach more people. And we'll see you again very soon for another episode of Talk ADHD.